At the time, the days were all about meat. They were either good or bad, depending on the slice. When you managed to slice the brisket so sheer that you could see your father through the marbled red flesh, you were the meat master. The good kid, the promised. But if the slice was anything less than translucent, your father would shout to your mother, pickling the kimchi in the pantry, "Jijun, the fruit of your womb is squandering my best fillet again." Even my sweat smelt of smoked flesh and cabbage. I scrubbed with pear soap each morning, but the smell still oozed from my pores. We lived above my parents' Korean barbecue joint on 1st Avenue and 11th Street. In the days before international cuisine became a thing, and the Lower East Side morphed into the mating ground for goateed and hair-bunned hipsters. Then the area was mostly crack addicts who would shit in the gutter and then forget to pull up their pants afterwards. The restaurant was called Korean Barbecue. It was real imaginative. My parents had emigrated from Korea in their early 20s. My father started as a busboy and as a janitor at a public school, and my mother cleaned houses and worked nights in the kitchen of a kosher bagel store on 14th Street. Sorry about that. After 18 years of double shifts, they had saved enough to open their own 9-table restaurant that served bulgogi, short ribs, pork belly, brisket, and my mother's kimchi and signature dipping sauces. As second-generation immigrants, my sisters and I were statistically predestined to disappoint our parents, in that we succeeded. Whatever happened, they'd had it worse. And of course, there was me. On busy nights, my sisters maneuvered the limbs and tables in the narrow, smoky room to top up the beer mugs and pile on fresh flesh. Grease dribbled down the steamed-up windows, and I chopped and boned while blood dripped off the counter and onto my duct-tape boots. My thoughts would drift to Granny Smith apples and the strong, prominent chin of Dave Buckleridge from math class. Once, I must have been 11 or so, my father scolded me in front of Mrs. Golda, who was waiting to pick up her regular Tuesday takeout. "Luzem," she chided him, "take a load off Siwoo. He's a good boy," she said, patting her puffy pink hair and winking at me. My boning knife slid off the joint I was cleaning and clattered away. My father looked at me but said nothing. Her words jingled in my head. Of course, it wasn't the first time someone had called me boy, but there was something quite definite in the way Mrs. Golda had said it. Final, like she was the one who was going to decide this for me. That night in the bathroom, I pressed the lock and pulled up my t-shirt and pulled down my pajama pants. I balanced on a stool to get a better look. In the cracked little mirror, I saw hints of boy, but also, when I arched up on my toes, also of girl. Intersex was the word that the doctors used, and it never failed to make my mother flinch and look at the floor. When people can't tell what you are, they think it's politer to ignore you than to use the wrong pronoun. So I was, "Hey, you, Korean kid," or just thingy. When I went to middle school, my father and the principal agreed that, for now, I would use the boys' restroom and the boys' locker rooms. Naturally, I was not consulted. The principal later told me that this arrangement protected the girls in school, who found it hard to share their restrooms, whereas the boys wouldn't notice if Miss Piggy walked in and whipped out a penis. At the time, adults still really said inappropriate stuff like that. My father justified the arrangement by jabbing his finger at the words "preliminary male" on my creased birth certificate. To him, a preliminary son was better than none. In the basement at school, there was a restroom only the night janitor used. The sign on the door just said, "Service restroom." It smelled of Lysol and stale cigarettes. But the place was deserted during the day, so it became my private hideout. I changed there before gym, and I washed in the sink afterwards. I even started eating my lunch there. When I turned 14, the doctor sent me to a hospital where they started monitoring me closely. My parents came with me for the first few appointments, but after that I went alone to save us all the discomfort. It was mostly a lot of waiting around under heavy fluorescent lights. I thought doctors were supposed to be smart, but these guys, they always asked the same questions. They would start by asking if I felt any changes in my body, and end by handing me a support group pamphlet and asking me if I felt any inclination yet towards the male or female orientation. Seriously, they used orientation like it was the first day at a new school or something. Mostly, I just shrugged and waited until I was allowed to leave. It was a long subway ride home. The hospital I went to was way uptown. They treated me for free as long as I let them research my condition. This meant a lot of extra visits and having to drop my pants for large groups of doctors. But we had no health insurance, so I did what they asked. Sometimes the doctors spoke to me quietly of the possibility of normalizing surgery. When I was ready for it, of course, they would add quickly. Normalizing, another one of those words. When I got back from the hospital, my dad would ask me what they'd said and when they were going to fix things. I would mumble, walk to the kitchen and put on my apron. Later, my mother would stand behind me, pat me on the shoulder twice, and give it a gentle squeeze. Then, after 3 beats, she would ask me to carry the heavy cauldrons to the front. Later, hacking away at a cold half-pig from the freezer, I would pretend to be a doctor. That was normalizing myself some short ribs and some pork chops with a cleaver. I pounded the cadaver until my hand cramped up over the handle and a cold sweat dripped down my back. I was a chinless Korean, held together by duct tape. I smelt of pickles and smoked meat, and I took leftover scraps to school for lunch, and then I worked 6 hours a week, 6-hour shifts, 7 days a week. How would testosterone IVs, cleaving me open and adding a real penis, make me feel normal? At night, I would take out the crumpled support group pamphlets from my pockets. They were always in bright colors with lots of exclamation marks. Intersex North America can help. Understanding your ambiguous genitalia. How to be both. Ovo testes peer support for you and your family. On the covers were pictures of happy and beautiful parents hugging smiling kids, with in the background a dog catching a frisbee on a beach or in some garden. Somehow I found it hard to relate. I tossed them in the shoebox in the back of my cupboard. Before all the doctors, I had never really thought of the boy-girl thing in a black and white either-or kind of way. I knew I was supposed to decide at one point what it was that I felt, boy or girl. But I didn't feel either. I just felt like me. If I dreamt of Dave Buckleridge, it was his prominent chin that I wanted, not him. It was sort of like my mother's dipping sauces. All our customers had a clear favorite and asked for extra servings of that. The Chens always wanted more samyang, whereas the Sabangs preferred the samgyeopsal, and others just wanted soy and wasabi. But I had never cared for any particular one over the other. Usually, I just mixed them all together to a brown, murky mess and dipped my pickles in that. At 15, I did make one big decision, but it wasn't the one my family hoped for. It started when I went to my second cousin Jimin's wedding reception. Her family had a popular deli on the Upper West Side, and the wedding was, for our standards, pretty lavish and Western. My family provided the meat for the buffet, but there were also fancy platters of things I had never eaten before. Arugula, artichokes, grilled zucchinis, beets and avocados. I heaped my plate so high with deep greens and bleeding reds that my dad slapped me on the wrist and shooed me and my sagging white plastic plate away. I pushed the bar on the emergency exit door and squatted down in the sun between the dumpsters in the small alley out back. Eyes closed and body wrapped around my plate, I slowly brought the loaded fork to my lips and sucked and slobbered every new zest, wallop, and tang, as if imprinting each new taste on my tongue. When I was licking my plate clean, my second cousin Jimin and her new husband left the reception in squeals and sprays of rice, and I snuck inside to restock my plate. The next day at school, I went to the home economics section of the library and checked out the classic vegetable cookbook and the modern girls' salad Bible and hid them under my bed at home. After work, I crawled into bed and devoured pictures of insalata caprese and artichoke heart salad. A few weeks later, I showed my mother a recipe for grilled vegetables and said maybe we could try that at the restaurant. Bell peppers, eggplants, and zucchini. I tapped on the picture. We could get the produce cheap from my uncle's deli, I added. She squinted at the picture for 1 second and then waved it away and told me to drain the noodles. A few months later, I was staring at a dead, trussed, fetal pig on a metal tray in front of me and wearing goggles and a plastic bib. My biology teacher, Mrs. Steiner, was in front of the chalkboard and in her sharp twang was explaining the importance of the sequential steps of proper dissection and good incision techniques. The classroom was hot and smelled of formaldehyde, teenage sweat, and over-applied deodorant. I checked the instruction sheet and used my scalpel to lightly score the flesh at the tip of the piglet's chin and make the first clean cut, straight down the middle to an upside-down Y. Peeling back flesh, I made some lateral incisions and cut through the sternum. Then I heard a whimper. I stared at the splayed, slit-open pig in alarm. Then I looked up and around, and I saw it was coming from Katie at the table to my right. Snot was dripping down her nose, and there were waning crescent moons of pooled tears in her goggles. Her whole body was shaking. Katie seemed nice. She had rusty lockets and a sprinkle of freckles around her pale, turned-up nose, and she always smiled at everybody, even me. I saw Mrs. Steiner march over to her now, wagging a finger high in the air. Katie turned away from her, sobbed, and ran from the room, letting the classroom door slap back so hard Miss Steiner had to jump out of its wake. We were told to get back to work. Later, Mrs. Steiner crooned over my pig. She called everyone over to marvel at my dismemberment. The other kids looked more concerned than anything else. Someone whispered, "Freak." Great. Just what I needed. Later, I saw Katie sitting alone in study hall. On my second try, I stopped at her table. Her face was splotchy, but she still smiled up at me. I asked if she was okay. We talked a bit. She explained that she was a vegetarian and could not cut up an animal, even if it was dead. I explained how fetuses were just a side product of the pork market. She said the meat market was vile. She couldn't understand how anyone could ignore the cruelty, pretend that another life was less worthy, think of animals only in parts, as pork chops or sausages, and not as living things with ears and eyes and feelings. I looked into her teary gray eyes and found myself nodding. Later, I walked back to the biology class and looked at my slayed pig, now on display on Mrs. Steiner's desk for the next class. I looked at the face, the slit eyes, the little hairs on the ears, the soft paws, the tail. It had been alive. But its life was not seen as worthy, and so apparently it was okay to butcher it. With my finger, I rubbed its cold snout. It didn't have much of a chin, either.